Stop what you're doing right now. Close the other tabs. Silence your phone. Look at the screen. What you are about to hear is not the version of events being looped across mainstream headlines. The talk of restoring democracy, counter-narcotics operations, or humanitarian intervention in Venezuela is a carefully engineered distraction. A narrative built for people who still believe that geopolitics in 2026 is driven by ideals, speeches, and press releases. It isn't. You're here because you already sense that something doesn't add up. You understand that when a superpower moves this fast, this decisively, and this publicly, it is never about values. It is about leverage. It is about control. And above all, it is about resources. Right now, at this moment, the world is not being shaped by ideology. It is being shaped by a quiet, ruthless game of resource chess. Every sanction, every naval deployment, every regime change is a move on a board where the only objective is securing the materials required to survive the next decade. What happened in Venezuela was not an accident. It was not a mistake. And it was not optional. The public story is designed to keep you focused on the surface: drugs, corruption, democracy, humanitarian concern. But beneath that narrative is a far more uncomfortable reality. In a world of fractured supply chains, collapsing trust, and rising bloc warfare, nations no longer negotiate for critical resources. They take them. If you are still interpreting global events through the lens of morality, you will miss what is unfolding in real time. If you are still asking whether something is justified, you are already behind the curve. This moment, right now, is the inflection point. The rules that governed global trade, energy, and commodities for decades are breaking down. And Venezuela is not the exception. It is the signal. Most people will only understand this after the consequences are unavoidable. You don't have that luxury. What you are about to hear is the ground truth behind America's move, stripped of narratives, stripped of excuses, and stripped of comforting illusions. This is not about what they say is happening. This is about what is actually happening. What you were told is simple. America intervened in Venezuela to restore order, remove a criminal regime, and stabilize a failing state. A familiar story. One that fits neatly into the language of democracy, human rights, and international law, but that is not what just happened. Yes, Venezuela was seized. Its leadership was removed. Its power structure collapsed almost overnight. Those facts are real, but the explanation attached to them is not. This operation was not about saving a population, stopping drugs, or exporting democracy, and it wasn't even primarily about oil. Oil is the cover story. The real target sits beneath the headlines, beneath the talking points, and beneath the assumptions most people still carry about global power. The real target is silver, not as a commodity, not as a trade, but as a strategic material. What unfolded in Venezuela was not the end of a crisis. It was the opening move in a much larger conflict over who controls the physical inputs required to run modern economies. This was not a reaction to chaos. It was a premeditated act in a world where resource security now overrides diplomacy. This is Markets in Context. My name is Kevin Hang. And if you want to understand what actually just happened and what it means going forward, you have to strip away the narrative and examine the mechanics. Because when you look at how this operation unfolded, the illusion falls apart. This was not a gradual escalation. It was not improvised. It was not debated into existence. The seizure of Venezuela unfolded with clinical precision, fast, quiet, and overwhelming. Key military and political nodes were neutralized almost simultaneously. Command and control structures were disrupted before any coordinated response could form. Elite units moved with speed and clarity of objective, not uncertainty. This was not a show of force. It was an execution of a plan that had already been finalized. Nothing about this was reactive. Operations of this complexity do not come together in days or weeks. They are rehearsed, modeled, and stress-tested months in advance. Legal justifications are drafted before the first aircraft moves. Logistics are positioned long before the first public statement is released. The speed itself is the evidence. The official justification, the removal of a criminal regime, exists to satisfy public consumption and international procedure. It is the story that allows the operation to pass through media filters and political institutions without triggering immediate resistance. But the strategic objective lies elsewhere. When a state commits this level of force at this moment in history, it is not to fix a problem. It is to secure an advantage. Venezuela was not seized because it failed. It was seized because what it sits on has become indispensable. This was not about restoring the past. It was about controlling the future, and silver is at the center of that future. The question you should be asking is not what happened. It's why now. Venezuela has been unstable for years. Its economy collapsed long ago. Its political crisis was already priced in by the world. If this intervention were truly about governance, corruption, or humanitarian concern, it could have happened at almost any point in the last decade. But it didn't. It happened now. And timing is never accidental. We are living in a moment of extreme system stress. Global supply chains that once operated on trust and efficiency are fractured. Economic blocks are hardening. Trade routes are being weaponized. Sanctions have replaced diplomacy, and coercion has replaced consensus. The post-Cold War assumption that markets would always remain open has quietly died. In that environment, a new doctrine has taken hold. Resource securitization. This doctrine is simple and brutal. If a material is critical to national survival, and access to it can no longer be guaranteed through markets or treaties, it must be secured directly. Not negotiated, not outsourced. Secured. Venezuela crossed from problem state to a non-optional asset the moment the global system stopped functioning on goodwill, the moment supply reliability mattered more than political optics, the moment the United States realized it could no longer assume that strategic materials would continue flowing simply because contracts existed. That is why this happened now, and this is where the popular explanation collapses. Yes, Venezuela sits on vast oil reserves. That is true, and that fact is repeated endlessly because it sounds sufficient. Oil is familiar. Oil is easy to understand. Oil fits the mental model most people still use to interpret power. But oil alone does not justify this level of risk. The United States is already a major energy producer. Global oil markets, while volatile, are diversified. Strategic petroleum reserves exist precisely to buffer disruptions. If this were only about barrels per day, there were cheaper, quieter ways to manage the problem. The oil narrative is the decoy. The deeper reality is that Venezuelan crude comes with technical constraints that make it useful but not decisive on its own. Heavy blends require specialized refining capacity. They solve specific bottlenecks, but they do not explain a full-spectrum geopolitical seizure. This is where the oil story collapses. Because oil is an input you can substitute, reroute, or replace over time. The true risk in 2026 is not energy scarcity alone. It is material scarcity. The kind of scarcity that cannot be solved by drilling more wells or opening another trade lane. Oil was the excuse that got the door open. The prize lies beneath it. And once you understand that, the timing stops being mysterious and starts looking inevitable. This is where the real story finally comes into focus. The asset at the center of America's move into Venezuela is not oil. It is silver, not as a relic, not as a hedge, and not as a speculative trade, but as an industrial necessity and a strategic material that modern civilization cannot function without. Silver is the most electrically conductive element on Earth. That single property makes it irreplaceable. You cannot replicate it with software. You cannot scale it with policy, and you cannot print it into existence. Every high-efficiency solar panel requires silver. Every electric vehicle powertrain relies on it. Advanced military electronics, precision-guided munitions, satellite systems, secure communications, and radar arrays all depend on silver at the atomic level. There is no substitute that performs the same function at the same reliability, cost, and scale. When silver disappears, systems don't slow down. They stop. This is why silver is no longer being treated as a commodity. It is being treated as a choke point. In previous decades, silver could be sourced quietly through global markets. Supply chains were long, complex, and assumed to be reliable. That assumption no longer holds. The moment supply certainty collapses, silver stops behaving like a metal and starts behaving like a strategic asset. Unlike oil, silver cannot be rerouted overnight. Unlike fiat currency, it cannot be created with keystrokes. And unlike financial instruments, it cannot be settled digitally when physical delivery matters. Silver exists only in the ground, in vaults, or in finished products. Once it is consumed, it is gone. Recycling helps, but it does not close the gap. And new mine supply takes years, often a decade, to bring online. This is the uncomfortable reality that now governs global planning. Modern militaries do not fight wars with ideology. They fight wars with electronics, supply chains, power systems, and materials that make those systems possible. Silver sits at the intersection of all of them. That is why control over silver is no longer optional. It is foundational. What happened in Venezuela was not about reclaiming the past. It was about securing the inputs required to operate in the future. Silver is the linchpin, the quiet dependency hiding inside every advanced technology the modern world takes for granted. The longer this reveal was delayed, the more powerful it becomes, because once you see it, every other explanation falls apart. To understand why the United States moved when it did, you have to look east. Because just days before Venezuela was seized, a far quieter event sent shockwaves through the global system. No missiles, no airstrikes, no breaking news banners. Just a regulatory notice that functioned like a silent detonation inside the world's supply chains. China pulled the lever. At the start of the new year, Beijing implemented a new export control regime on silver. On paper, it looked technical, bureaucratic. almost boring. In reality, it was one of the most aggressive acts of economic warfare in decades. The mechanics are simple. Under the new rules, silver cannot leave China unless the exporter is state-approved, meets strict production thresholds, and operates under licenses that can be revoked at any time. In practice, this does not restrict some supply. It filters almost all of it. China is not just another producer in the silver market. It is the world's dominant refiner, the central processor through which raw silver becomes usable industrial metal. When China tightens that valve, silver doesn't get more expensive. It disappears. The single regulatory move effectively removed a massive portion of refined silver from global circulation overnight. Not gradually, not over quarters, instantly. Western manufacturers woke up to contracts that still existed on paper but no longer guaranteed physical delivery. That is what makes this different from tariffs or sanctions. This was not a negotiation tactic. It was a strategic declaration, a signal that silver would now be treated the same way China treats rare earth elements and advanced semiconductors, as a controlled resource tied directly to national priorities. And those priorities are clear. China's industrial strategy depends on silver. Its solar expansion, electric vehicle production, grid modernization, and military electronics all consume it relentlessly. By locking down exports, Beijing ensured that its own build-out would continue uninterrupted, while everyone else was forced to compete for what remained. From a geopolitical standpoint, this was not subtle. It was a message. In a world where economic pressure has replaced open conflict, China demonstrated that it could cripple foreign industries without firing a shot, that it could weaponize regulation the same way others weaponize navies. This is the pressure that made Venezuela unavoidable. Once China restricted silver, the global market did not tighten, it fractured. And when one superpower closes the door on a strategic material, the others do not wait politely in line. They secure what they can. The China shock didn't cause the crisis by itself, but it set the timer. And when the countdown reached zero, Venezuela was next. This is where the system breaks. On their own, China's export controls would have been disruptive. Painful, but manageable. On their own, Venezuela's instability could have remained a regional problem. Troubling, but containable. Together, they formed something far more dangerous. The moment China restricted silver exports, the United States lost the luxury of time. What had once been a global market became a fragmented battlefield. Access was no longer guaranteed by contracts or trade relationships. It was determined by proximity, control, and force. In that new reality, geography suddenly mattered again. The Western Hemisphere contains the largest remaining untapped reserves of strategic materials outside of Chinese influence, and Venezuela sits at the center of that map, not as a failed state, but as a stockpile, one that could no longer be allowed to drift, leak, or fall under competing control. This is why the seizure of Venezuela was not an act of expansion. It was an act of containment. From Washington's perspective, allowing Venezuelan silver to remain locked in chaos, or worse, to flow through illicit networks aligned with adversarial blocs, was no longer acceptable. Once China closed the eastern supply valve, securing Western supply was no longer optional. It was defensive. This is the point most commentary misses. The move into Venezuela was not about gaining something new. It was about preventing a catastrophic loss of access in a world where redundancy had vanished. And this is where the crisis becomes nonlinear. We are now in what can only be described as a double-engine event. The first engine is industrial panic. Manufacturers depend on silver to keep production lines alive. When supply certainty collapses, they do not speculate, they hoard. They bypass markets, break contracts, and pay whatever is required to secure physical metal. Just in time becomes just in case. The second engine is monetary panic. Investors watching superpowers seize resources by force do not worry about quarterly earnings. They worry about counterparty risk, about asset freezes, about rules changing overnight. Capital stops trusting promises and starts seeking substance. When these two forces ignite at the same time, markets don't adjust, they convulse. Industrial buyers and financial capital are no longer competing in separate lanes. They are chasing the same finite pool of physical material. One needs it to operate, the other needs it to survive. This is why the convergence matters. It transforms a supply disruption into a systemic event. A moment where traditional pricing models stop working because demand is no longer driven by profit alone, but by fear. China lit the fuse, Venezuela became the pressure point, and the global system absorbed the impact all at once. From here on, every move is reactionary, every delay carries risk, and every assumption built on the old order becomes a liability. To see what happens next, you have to look beneath the headlines and into the machinery of the market itself. Most people think the price of silver is discovered by supply and demand for metal. It isn't. It's discovered through paper, through futures contracts, derivatives, and digital claims that promise delivery at some point in the future. For decades, this abstraction worked because trust existed. Participants assumed that if they ever wanted the metal, it would be there. Contracts could be rolled, Positions could be settled in cash. Very few people ever asked for physical delivery. That assumption is now breaking. There's a fundamental disconnect between paper silver and physical silver. Paper can be created infinitely. Contracts can be layered on top of each other with almost no friction. Physical metal cannot. It must be mined, refined, transported, and stored. Every ounce is finite. Over time, this has created an imbalance, a market where claims on silver vastly exceed the amount of silver that actually exists in deliverable form. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a structural byproduct of financialization. As long as no one challenges the system, it holds. Crises change that psychology instantly. When geopolitical shocks hit, when supply chains fracture and trust erodes, participants stop treating contracts as financial instruments and start treating them as promises that might not be kept. In that environment, rolling a contract forward feels reckless. Settling in cash feels dangerous. So they do the one thing the system is not designed for. They ask for the metal. This is what is known as a run on the bank, and it doesn't require panic to begin. It only requires doubt. The moment enough participants decide they want physical delivery at the same time, the abstraction collapses under its own weight. Financial models assume continuity. They assume rules will be honored and liquidity will always appear. But trust is the invisible pillar holding those models upright. When trust fails, the equations still work on paper, but reality stops cooperating. This is how financial abstractions break. What was once a stable, predictable mechanism becomes brittle. Prices no longer reflect efficiency or equilibrium. They reflect urgency, availability, and fear of being the last one holding a promise instead of an asset. This is the phase the silver market is entering now. Not because of speculation, not because of hype, but because the foundational assumption that paper and physical are interchangeable has been quietly invalidated. And once that realization spreads, there is no way to reverse it. To understand where this ultimately leads, you have to step away from the charts. Screens can lie, models can delay reality. But systems failure always reveals itself at the human level first. When a financial system breaks, it doesn't announce itself with a press conference. It shows up in empty ATMs, dark payment terminals, and markets where prices stop being posted in the local currency because the numbers no longer mean anything. This is already happening. When a currency collapses, people don't debate exchange rates. They ask a simpler question. What will work today? What can buy food, fuel, or safe passage? What will still be accepted when the bank is closed and the power is unreliable? In those moments, money reverts to its oldest form. Not digits, not promises, substance. Silver has played this role for thousands of years, and it always returns when trust disappears, not because of tradition, but because of function. It is divisible, durable, universally recognizable, and impossible to fabricate on demand. This is where the difference between price and value becomes undeniable. On a screen, silver may be quoted at a neat, orderly number, but on the ground, in a stressed environment, that number loses relevance. What matters is the survival price, the price someone is willing to accept when they need to eat, move, or escape. In those conditions, silver does not trade like a commodity. It trades like money. A small amount can buy what paper wealth cannot. It can bridge the gap when systems freeze. It can move through spaces where digital assets fail and institutions no longer function. And this is the most important lesson. When systems collapse, valuation becomes situational. The same ounce of silver can be worth far more or far less, depending on who holds it and what they need at that moment. That divergence between the screen price and the survival price is not an anomaly. It is the truth that financial markets are designed to obscure. Once you see it, the abstract risks being discussed in policy rooms and trading floors become real, tangible, human. This is what happens when trust disappears. And it is why silver never truly loses its monetary role. It only waits. What happened in Venezuela was not interpreted the same way everywhere. In Washington, it was framed as enforcement. In the media, it was packaged as necessity. But in capitals across the world, especially outside the Western Alliance, it was read very differently. It was read as a precedent. Other nations did not see a single intervention. They saw proof that the rules can change overnight, that sovereignty is conditional, that access to resources, reserves, and even leadership can be redefined by force if the strategic calculus demands it. This is what is meant by empire risk. Empire risk is not about collapse. It is about unpredictability, the realization that the framework governing global finance and trade is no longer neutral, that it can be overridden when interests collide. Once that realization takes hold, trust begins to erode, not in a dramatic rush, but in a steady, irreversible withdrawal. For decades, the dollar-based system functioned because it was perceived as stable, rules-driven, and insulated from sudden political seizure. Assets held within it were assumed to be safe as long as contracts were honored and institutions remained intact. That assumption is now under strain. When nations watch a sovereign government removed and its resources effectively placed under new control, they ask a simple question. If it can happen there, why not here? The answer no longer feels theoretical. This is why the reaction is not rhetorical. It is structural. Countries begin reassessing where their wealth is held, in what form and under whose jurisdiction. Exposure to systems that can be frozen, sanctioned, or redefined becomes a liability. Dependency on promises becomes a risk factor. And this is where hard assets regain relevance, not because of ideology, not because of nostalgia, but because they exist outside the permission structure of global finance. They do not rely on clearinghouses, correspondent banks, or political goodwill. They are owned by possession alone. Gold, silver, and other tangible assets begin to look less like investments and more like insurance, protection against a world where stability is no longer assumed. This is the broader implication of the Venezuela seizure. It is not about one country. It is about how every country recalibrates its understanding of safety in a system where power, not process, increasingly sets the rules. Once that shift occurs, it does not reverse. To make sense of what comes next, you have to separate time horizons. This is not a single event with a clean resolution. It is a transition, and each phase behaves differently. In the short term, we are in the shock phase. This is the period of volatility, repricing, and dislocation. Information is uneven, liquidity is stressed, prices move sharply, not because fundamentals change day to day, but because participants are adjusting to a new reality all at once. Expect violent swings, sudden shortages, and reactions driven by fear rather than equilibrium. This phase feels chaotic because it is. Old assumptions are being unwound faster than new ones can replace them. The medium term looks very different. As the immediate shock fades, the system does not return to normal. Instead, it settles onto a higher plateau. Supply constraints remain. Trust does not magically reappear. Participants adapt by building buffers, hoarding inputs, and paying premiums for certainty. This is where the price floor rises. Volatility compresses, but levels remain elevated. What once felt extreme becomes routine. The idea that prices should go back loses relevance because the conditions that supported lower prices no longer exist. Normalization never arrives. The long-term outlook is defined by something far more rigid: structural scarcity. Bringing new supply online is slow, capital-intensive, and politically complex. Years of underinvestment cannot be reversed quickly. Declining ore grades, regulatory friction, and long development timelines ensure that supply growth lags demand by design. This creates inevitability, not in the sense of straight-line forecasts, but in direction. The system is constrained, demand is embedded, supply is delayed. Over time, that imbalance asserts itself regardless of sentiment, cycles, or temporary relief. This is why the story does not end with stabilization. It ends with repricing. Understanding these phases matters because it replaces panic with orientation. It allows you to see which moves are noise, which are adjustment, and which are structural. The danger is not volatility. The danger is assuming the old baseline still exists. When we say it's over, we are not talking about a single market move or a temporary crisis. What's over is an era. The era of cheap resources is finished. The assumption that critical materials will always be abundant, accessible, and quietly delivered through global markets no longer holds. Scarcity is no longer a risk scenario. It is the operating condition. The era of stable assumptions is also over. The belief that trade rules are fixed, that sovereignty guarantees safety, and that systems will behave tomorrow the way they did yesterday has been shattered. The events surrounding Venezuela made that break visible. The rules did not bend, they changed, and the era of paper suppression is over. For decades, financial abstractions masked physical reality. Prices were shaped by contracts, leverage, and models that assumed continuity and trust. That framework only works when no one challenges it. Once physical delivery matters, once possession becomes the priority, the illusion collapses. Silver is not just participating in this shift, it is signaling it. Silver is not the story by itself. It is the indicator, the canary in the system, the material that exposes where the old structure fails because it sits at the intersection of technology, energy, and monetary trust. This is why the opening moment matters. When the world woke up on January 3rd, 2026, and saw a sovereign nation effectively seized in real time, something fundamental clicked. The move into Venezuela was not just geopolitical. It was a confirmation that resource security now outranks process, precedent, and persuasion. That is what is over. The past did not end gradually. It ended at a specific moment, and everything that follows is being priced through that lens. If you understand that, the noise falls away. What remains is the signal. What you've just seen is not a reaction to the news cycle. It's an examination of structure, of incentives, constraints, and power dynamics that operate regardless of what is said publicly. This channel exists to focus on what actually moves the system, not narratives designed for mass consumption, but the mechanics that persist after attention moves on. When events appear chaotic, it is usually because the underlying logic has not been explained. That is the purpose here. As global conditions continue to shift, the volume of information will increase while clarity becomes harder to find. More voices, more opinions, more urgency, less understanding. In environments like that, the advantage belongs to those who can slow the picture down and see how the pieces connect. If this perspective resonates, stay connected, not for predictions or reassurance, but for ongoing context, analysis that builds over time and helps you stay oriented as assumptions continue to break. There's no return to the old framework. The transition is already in motion. We'll continue mapping it as it unfolds. Remain focused.